Well, it is 10 o'clock by my clock, and I'm going to get us started. And want to just first to say how glad Melinda and I are to be back with you. Traveling here yesterday was more of an ordeal than it's ever been, but it was worth it to get here and then to wake up to see the world look like it did this morning. This is it's great, and really I'm glad to see your faces again and know you're doing well. And I keep up with you. I get your weekly newsletter online and pay attention to the prayer requests from one of the Sunday school classes that still sends those to me, and so I appreciate that. And I still continue to have contact, of course, with Mike Stroop and with Rick Carpenter, so I hear about you from a lot of different directions, and always glad. Melinda and I had dinner with Hewlett and Sheila Glower, was it last week before last, and they said to send greetings to you all as well, so greetings from the Glowers. We've had a really interesting number of things happen to us since we were last with you. A year ago, I had brain surgery, and that was to remove an acoustic neuroma in my right ear, and the consequence of that, that's the only consequence of that, they did determine I did have a brain, and some fluff. There was some fluff in my ear. They removed that. But I have no hearing in my right ear. And so if you want to speak, I hope you do. I hope we are able to talk together today. But I can't tell where the sound's coming from. So if you just sort of either, wave your hand if you want to say something, I'll find you. Otherwise, I'm just going to start looking for where the voice is coming from. And and speak up. That helps a lot too. We've had that. My daughter got married last spring, our last child at home, and graduated from University of Texas, and then got married about 4 months later. Melinda passed her doctoral prelim exams just a month or so ago, and our son deployed to Afghanistan and came back home. All that's happened in the last year. So our family's just had a few kind of things going on, and we're happy to be all in one piece. I want to talk a little bit about what I hope for us to do in the short time that we're going to be thinking together today, and try to set some expectations. We're going to be talking about family this morning, and then we're going to be talking about congregational life this afternoon. And it's not a Bible study. I will refer to places in the Bible and stories in the Bible that relate to some of the things I want to talk about, but that's not what this is going to be about. And it's not about how to have a happy family or how to have a better marriage, although these things may help with all of that. It's really about understanding families and understanding how families work and how human beings behave in relationships and how that spills over into congregational life. It is a perspective that is called family systems theory, and it's not any newly developed thing, just observations of the way that human beings seem to behave, especially under certain circumstances. And it starts with family, and that's why we're going to start there and try to understand it. Really am eager for you to interrupt, it's not an interruption, but to interrupt my spiel with discussion if you want to, or certainly after the break we'll come back and have a chance to kind of digest some of this together. So there's an outline that you can follow. I'll try to stick kind of close to that as we talk about these things. I'd like to begin calling this first section the fire in which we were forged. Like Frodo in the ring, the only way to deal with it is to go back to the fire in which it was forged. And to deal with ourselves in any significant way that affects change and maturity, we have to connect with the fire in which we were forged, which is family. And it's not just that family of mom and dad and sisters and brothers. We were forged in a fire that's gone on for a long, long time, multi-generations. Read with me this text from Isaiah 51, 1 and 2. Let's read it aloud together. Listen to me, you who pursue righteousness and who seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were cut and to the quarry from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who gave you birth. Isaiah tells the people in exile as they're thinking about their future and how they're going to be and how they're going to pursue righteousness and become, again, the people of God that they were intended to be. We don't begin and move into the future by starting from here. we start from where we've come. We come with a whole tradition, a whole series of things. And if you're going to pursue righteousness and be the people of God in the future following this period of exile, you're going to look back to the rock from which you were hewn, to Abraham your father, Sarah your mother. This is where we've come from. It's the same with our lives, that our moving well into the future requires us to know a good bit about our story, about where we've come from and what's brought us to this point. And you didn't get here on your own. This is just not an individual enterprise called life. You didn't arrive on your own. You didn't survive on your own. You didn't figure it out on your own. In fact, neither did your parents or their parents or their parents. In the 5 generations that preceded you, there were 62 families involved in just the last 5 generations preceding you. In the last 9 generations preceding you, there were over 1,000 families that brought you into being. That's part of your story. And you don't just show up with some genetic code and that defines your life. All of this has flowed together into our lives, as we'll see, and lots more passes between generations than just DNA. Now, you may get your eye color and your hair color and your height and body shape and something from some genetic code that has been given to you by your biological parents, but they got theirs from someone who got it from someone who got it from someone, and that goes way back. And then there's a whole field of investigation these days that I have read about but do not pretend to understand, so don't ask me any questions about it, called epigenetics, which has to do with how the genes in our chromosomes are turned on or turned off while we're still alive, not before we're born. I mean, in the course of life, a gene can be turned on or off by a variety of external forces of life. And so the environment that we live in and our relationships we live in have a huge impact on the person that we are and what we become. We have a fire in which we were forged, and it is our family. And all families are interesting, and they're full of both, geniuses and horse thieves. So we don't need to be embarrassed about our families or overly proud about them either, for that matter. We have come from a lot of different things, but we need to know it to best understand ourselves and grow forward. Mentioning, you've come from a long line of folks in just 9 generations. But here's some things that pass between generations that sometimes we don't pay attention to. DNA, of course, does. That's the one we're most aware of. But there are a lot of other things that the generations teach us and pass on that get hardwired into our thinking, our way of life, and operate for the most part below a level of consciousness for us. For example, how secure is the world? Is the world a secure place, a place that you can explore and a place you can be in with some degree of security, or is the world a terribly frightful, dangerous place to live in? Those kind of attitudes get passed on from parents to children and grandparents to grandchildren in just unconscious ways. We grow up learning, probably from the time we are small infants, that it's okay to be in this world or it's scary to be in this world. And that doesn't happen when we're 10 years old. That probably happens pretty soon after we arrive and start breathing air on the planet, maybe even before that. Security. And so families live with more or less degree of security in the world and about various things. I mean, there's some people who feel very secure in the city, but they get scared when they get out in the rural area because there's all kinds of unknowns. The world's dangerous out there, but we're safe here. Or we're safe out here, but boy, those cities are dangerous. And when we wander in there, there's a lot of nervousness. And we didn't learn that from a book or even from our own experience, but we picked it up from mom and dad or grandpa and grandma or somebody. I remember reading a story by a guy named Ron Richardson. He was talking about the way in which we learn that things are threats or not threats. And he was telling about going early in his marriage off to the mountains with his new wife, and they were staying in a cabin in some place, sort of like this up in the hills somewhere. And they went to sleep that night, turned the light off, and heard a noise in the room. And she said that there's something in the room, and he went and turned the light on, and sure enough, there was a bat in the room flopping around. And almost without thinking, he went and he looked around, he found a newspaper and a broom, and he knocked the bat to the floor, wrapped it in newspaper, and released it out the front door. His wife was screaming. And she said, "How did you know to do that?" And he said, "I don't know." And then in a minute, he remembered that when he was a little boy, he was at his grandmother's house, and there was a bat in the house. And she knocked it down with a broom, wrapped it up in something, and threw it out the door. And he had just sort of filed that away in his brain that bats are a nuisance, but they're not life-threatening, and he could respond with a little more thoughtfulness, whereas his wife had no experience with bats at all, and it was, except Dracula or something in the movie. So security is one of those things. One of the things we pass down from generation to generation are attitudes about marriage, how marriage is done, and about reproduction, and about sexuality. All of those things are things that get absorbed more than taught and transmitted from one generation to another. They're sometimes easy to see as you start looking at family stories going back for a while. Attitudes about death and dying, how we die, how we bury, how we grieve, are all things that we more or less get from folks who have gone before us, and we've watched it happen, observed it, and filed it away and learned about it. Attitudes about money and about security around money and how money is used and whether it's worth fighting about or is it just a necessity you learn to manage, and how hard do you have to work to have it, and all of those kind of things are deeply absorbed attitudes. Dominance of, and I guess you could just say gender roles, but try to go forward. There we go. Gender roles. What are men's roles and women's roles, and who is dominant in a family are often things that are passed on within a family system from one generation to another. Addictions are other things. Susceptibility to disease. That's more than just genetic. It's interesting to start looking at family histories for several generations and find in one family a series of cardiac events. In another family, it may be cancer. Another family seems to be free from those, but they are dealing with emotional illnesses right and left. And there are some ways, very subtle, in which those things get transmitted between generations. Families are also the places we go to find our strengths. You wouldn't be here if you didn't have a family strong enough to survive. And your family, 1,000 people managed to survive long enough for you to be here over the last 9 generations. That's saying something. And in every family story and family tree, there are huge sources of strength and resource there if you've got make the effort to discover them. And one of the ways that I want to focus most on is this last one, is that things pass between generations. One of the things that passes is the way that we manage threat or the way we manage anxiety. It sort of goes back to that security issue. And we'll see in a little bit how that works in families. I'm going to use this word anxiety a good bit in a leadership class that I teach. I tell the class on the first day, if this were Sunday school and I ask a question and you weren't sure about the answer, what would you venture to guess would be the answer? Jesus, right, okay. And so I tell them, now in this class, if you're not sure what the answer is, try anxiety. You've got a pretty high chance of getting it right. Anxiety is a term we're going to use, and it's not just worry. Anxiety is a physical response that God has hardwired into us to help us survive. There are 2 flavors that anxiety comes in as we think about this. One is what is called acute anxiety. And this is, if you want to put it this way, the good kind. It is our ability to respond to threat instantaneously. You're driving along the road and maybe paying attention, maybe not sort of paying attention, but suddenly a child dashes out across the road in front of you. Amazing things happen in your mind and body in that just split second. One thing is you change physically in that split second. There are neurotransmitters that begin to fire off in your brain. There's an adrenal response that sends cortisol and other things to parts of the body. Digestion shuts down. Blood flow goes to the larger muscles of the body. There is blood pressure changes, heart rate changes, breathing changes. All that happens in a split second. And at the same time, you are taking in the things you need to know. You've quit observing the dogwood blooming on the side. You're not paying attention to how nice somebody's house was painted. You're seeing only the things you need to know. You get tunnel vision. You see the child. You're looking in the mirror. The mirror. You're pulling the car over to the left if it's safe, stepping on the brake. All of that stuff you know to do reflexively, instantaneously. And if everything turns out okay, You may have to pull over to the side of the road and breathe deeply and calm down, but gradually the system reboots and goes back to normal, heart rate adjust and all those kind of things, and you just breathe a sigh of relief. God wired us that way to live. Acute anxiety is response to a threat that is either real, that is real, but that is time limited. Okay? Acute anxiety is a response to a threat that is real or time limited. And it doesn't just have to do with anxiety of nervousness or worry. It is this whole stress response that we have been wired up to do, and it's very good. God created us so for our survival. Now here's the problem. There's another flavor that anxiety comes in. It's called chronic anxiety. Chronic anxiety is response to a threat that is either exaggerated or unreal and is not time limited. Exaggerated, unreal, not time limited. It is this sort of ambient level of anxiousness that we live with, and people vary in how much they live with all the time. And it is part of what we've gotten from the families that we've come from. We live, all of us, with some level all the time of this. And it's the same chemicals flowing through our blood that God designed to save us in times of stress, but are quite corrosive and destructive to be in our system all the time. And this is why Jesus and Paul and others are frequently telling us to find our peace in God, to be anxious for nothing, but with everything, with prayer and supplication, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God. There is this need to be calmer, at peace through the course of life. Now, when there's a threat, we need to respond to it. But we don't live surrounded by saber-toothed tigers and, axe murderers all the time. That's not our normal way of going through life. But our minds and our bodies live with a level of anxiety that we were not created to live with like that. And it can be very destructive. And it is one of the ways that things we learn from families. How safe is the world? How anxious should I be? And we pick that up mostly from our parents and our grandparents, and who picked it up from their parents and grandparents. And families and individuals are more or less able to function well in the presence of high anxiety. Now, if you live with an ambient level of it and then more stuff comes in, eventually what will happen, as we'll see, is the cup overflows into symptoms. And we'll look at some of those. The Creech family this past year, who, like everybody else, lives with some ambient level of anxiety, married a daughter off. One father had brain surgery, wife had major exams to take, and one son went off to war. Those are called anxiety-producing events, okay? All of them. Even good things raise our level of anxiety. And it would be normal that some of the things we'll see as symptoms might show up if we don't manage them in some other ways. But these pass between generations, and one of the things that passes is how we manage the anxiety in our life. Does that make sense? Are you with me? Anybody want to, that's a really important concept, or we're going to talk about the rest. Is anybody want to ask or say or add anything about that? I'm going to, yes, sir.
There's no possible chronic stress from not having enough nutrition your whole life or something. I mean, either way, it's acute. It's always acute or exaggerated.
Yeah, I think so. Do you think of an example of different? I mean,
like I'm saying, if you live in an unstable area where you're always under
yeah, you could be living in constant acute anxiety, and anxiety is sort of once it gets started. I mean, even chronic anxiety can originate or be raised to a higher level by an acute thing that was a real threat you had to deal with, and then you sort of live there. You don't recycle back down to normal. The problem, one of the problems with this is that when we're functioning in an anxious state, and God designed us this way, is, like I said, you get tunnel vision. You just see the things you need to see. We're not thoughtful. When the kid's running out across the road in front of your car, this is not time to pull out a legal pad and make 2 columns of pros and cons about possible responses, right? Now, there is a place to be thoughtful in life. That is not the place. This is the place to respond automatically. But what happens is, as we live with more anxiety in our life, we tend to respond automatically in all or most of our relationships, and then we use our thinking mind to come up with a reason for what we just did. We don't think and then act. We act and then think and come up with a good logical explanation for why we did what we did or said what we said. In the recovery movement, they use the definition for rationalize. It means to tell rational lies, which is what we tend to do. Is they make sense to us. We make up our motive after the fact very often, but a good bit of what we do is running on automatic. And it's not all destructive, but in an intense situation, automatic responses where the threat is not real, automatic responses are usually not helpful. They don't help the situation. What congregations need, what families need, are some people who can be legitimately thoughtful in the face of threat, not just responding automatically if it's not life-threatening. I have this wonderful iPad here that Baylor University lets me use, but it's got a permanent setting that cannot be changed without going back to IT, that goes to sleep if you don't touch it every so often. So, and then it's got an 8-digit password to enter that you can't do while you're talking. Okay, try again. Okay, once more with feeling. Okay, we're back. If I just remember to touch it occasionally, it's happy. Okay, so it's very sensitive about that. So we're going to look at what?
Here, I'm sorry.
Okay.
What Jonathan's talking about sounds a lot like somebody in war that ends up with PTSD that can't come out of the anxious.
And this is one way that I know people have tried to think about. In severely anxious situations of war, not just the military, but the population that it's in a war-torn area, or in places where famine is present and life is threatened all the time. I mean, you would expect there to be a pretty high level of anxiety present, and some of it legitimate, not all of it, but again, we don't sit around and think and sort that stuff out. I mean, you just live with it in the middle of it. But where life is genuinely threatened all the time, you're likely to have very anxious people, and some of the things we talk about show up. And anxiety has a way, once it's started, of spiraling. As you'll see what some of the symptoms are of it, the symptoms themselves produce anxiety, which makes the symptoms more common, and it can spiral up. And there are ways of thinking differently about it. Let's take a look at what I mean about it. This is one way of understanding how some things, like I just mentioned, pass from generation to generation. Me talking about families as emotional systems. Now, when I use the word emotional, it's another technical term in this way of thinking. It doesn't mean feelings. It means those responses that are automatic, that originate from a part of our brains that is not the rational part. It's the automatic responses. Emotional basically means it is the automatic. It comes from one of the simpler views of the brain that is still being used somewhat, is to think of the brain as being in 3 parts. There is the brain stem that some people refer to as the reptilian brain, because it is the part of the brain that we share in common with reptiles. And it runs on automatic. It keeps our heart rate going, it keeps us breathing, it regulates our blood pressure, a number of things. We don't have to think about those things at all. It's totally unconscious, and we share that in common with the reptiles. Now, because that part of the brain has nothing to do with relationships, if you have a pet snake or pet iguana or a pet alligator or turtle, as much as you love that creature and care for it and feed it, the creature does not love you in return. It will automatically bite you if it gets a chance. It doesn't matter. They can't develop relationships. They don't have a brain for that. And we have the similar brain structure. It's reptilian. And I've seen people go reptilian on each other, and I probably have been there. So then there's another part of our brain that is called the mammalian brain because we share that brain structure in common with mammals on the planet. And it is built for relationships and is very sensitive to relationships. One of the interesting stories coming out of the tsunami several years ago that hit in Indonesia, a large wave also hit the coast of Africa out of that earthquake. And apparently a hippo and her baby were near the coast when that happened, and at least the mother was washed out to sea. If the baby was, it made it back, but eventually there was a baby hippo wandering around there, spotted by several folks, and without its mother, and it was very young, and they captured it and took it to a zoo, and the only place they had to put it in that zoo was with one of those large tortoises. The tortoise is a reptile, the hippo is a mammal, and it's a lonely mammal whose mother's gone. And so the hippo just befriends the tortoise and hangs out with it, lays on it, cuddles it, and the tortoise is just like, it is not really moved by all of this. But there are a lot of, you can find the pictures of the two of them on the internet. They're kind of interesting. But you see those two sort of brains at work there. Well, our mammalian brain, that part of us also runs on automatic, and it's very sensitive to relationships. It's always monitoring stuff, and we act automatically there. Then we have another part of our brain that God has given us that is the prefrontal cortex, and it's the thinking part of our brain. It's the place can actually, if exercised appropriately, override the other two. I mean, people who work at it can learn to regulate blood pressure and heart rate and other things intentionally. It's sort of an overriding system, but most of the time we use it backwards. We use the intellectual system after the emotional system is acted, then we rationalize. And I'll say all that to say, in the midst of anxiety, very few of us have access to our thinking. When we're running on automatic, we are running on automatic. And that can save us in certain situations. But in others, where it's ongoing, we really need to think. And if you're in a group of anxious people, it may be that you have nobody there who's thinking very much. And the ability to think is what we're after. So we're interested in how do these things pass from generations, and what is an emotional system? And an emotional system, this is one way of trying to portray it. In what I will put up on the screen, occasionally the squares will represent males and the circles represent females. That's just sort of conventional way of doing that in family system diagrams of various sorts. And so I don't know why that is, but just so you'll know. But if you look at this is an attempt to describe what an emotional system is. For one thing, it's bounded by this field, okay? All these people they're closely related to each other. We'll assume this is a family, that they are closely related to each other, and so there is a sort of field around them, like you might think about, that other people are not so affected by what goes on among them, but all the people within that field, that unit, are affected by what goes on with each other. And then there's place outside it that is where outside stressors come about. We live in a world where there is terrorism. We live in a world that is binary, and there are either or things all the time presented to us. We live in a world where, nature may erupt with an earthquake or a snowstorm or a blizzard. There's all kinds of outside stressors, but they play a part in this too. But the main thing here is, in an emotional unit, these people are always sensitive to each other. We monitor each other unconsciously all the time around issues like this, expectations. What do I expect of the others in my family, and are they meeting my expectations? And what do they expect of me, and am I meeting their expectations? If I'm not meeting their expectations, we know that because we pick it up. We don't have to have a family meeting to say, let's talk about our expectations and how one another's meeting them. We've got dials on our dashboard that are measuring that all the time. Dependency. Who's dependent on me, and am I okay with them feeling dependent on me? Do I want to be dependent on? And who am I dependent on? And are the people that I'm dependent on dependable? And so if a person I feel dependent on is ill or stressed out about something else, and I feel dependent on them, what does that create in me? Anxiety, not Jesus. Anxiety, okay. Approval. Does she like what Goddard, does he, did he enjoy that meal? Am I being approved of? Is a thing we're monitoring all the time. Mom and Dad like me. Why did Dad make that face at me? Does that mean he didn't approve of me? All of that's being monitored. Distress. If I feel in distress, is anybody noticing it? Or I pick up that someone in the family is in distress, and is anybody moving toward them? Should I do that? Who's paying attention to me? My brother's looking at me. Stop looking at me. Look at me. I mean, we've got all this stuff. And probably there's a long list of others. Well, you can imagine that all of the time we've got this kind of radar system running that's limited to the people primarily in our family, and we are constantly, subconsciously monitoring all of these kind of things. And if one person changes, it shifts stuff in the whole place. And when anxiety is generated, and there's already some level of anxiety in every family, I said that, but if it is raised for any reason, it spreads very quickly. Anxiety is contagious. Actually, everything is, but anxiety certainly is. So let's make up a story here. Let's suppose this is the dad and the mom right here, and they've got 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls. And let's say Dad's had a pretty good day out in the work world. Things have gone well, did a presentation, and it was well received, and some of the colleagues, applauded that. And he's had a pretty decent day. He even took off a little bit early and got home before traffic was bad, and he came home. The kids are home from school, and so he picks up the newspaper and sits down, makes a cup of coffee, and he's relaxed. Anxiety level's pretty low. Got a couple of one kid's working on homework, one's playing a video game. Life is. Mom, on the other hand, that's Dad. Mom, on the other hand, has not had a good day. She's a school counselor, and she's had angry parents she's dealt with. She's had some teachers she's dealt with, some rotten kids that have been in her office, and just a variety of things. And in fact, her work kept her a little late today, and she got into the middle of the worst traffic she's seen in a long time, and there were wrecks on the freeway. And when she got home, she was pretty much a wreck too, and she pulls into that's called anxiety, okay? And we're going to assume this is a less mature version of a family, and they're responding this way. So when Mom walks in the door, having had a day like that, does anybody need to notify the rest of the family that Mom's day hasn't gone well? No. The way the door is closed, the posture when she walks in, what she says or doesn't say, how she says or doesn't say anything, are all monitored and responded to immediately. And she may walk in and notice he's sitting there reading the paper. There's nothing taken out of the refrigerator, nothing thawed out. And she goes in the kitchen, and you're talking under her breath telling me what. I mean, she's taking stuff out, banging pots and pans like Martha. And now, those signals are going out, and these folks are monitoring it. Depending on, and you'll see the different responses to anxiety, but depending on the responses, what this guy might do, this is a less mature family, okay? So what he might do is lay down his newspaper and go back to the study and turn on the computer and check stock reports. That's called distancing. In the presence of anxiety, one of our automatic responses is to get out of Dodge. And so he may do that, as well as may one of the sons, who may decide to go upstairs and study. Another way that we respond to anxiety is conflict. And it might be that these 2 kids pick a fight with each other. They were doing just fine until all this came. And all of a sudden they get into an argument. And it might be that one of the other kids decides, they hear that and they go to Mom's aid. They're monitoring this distress call, and they go in there and say, "Can I help?" And you can just see how the whole family is reacting and responding over stuff. Now, is there a life-threatening situation going on here? No. It's a horrible inconvenience when life goes that way, but life is not threatened. But the anxiety responses are automatic, and it's a system in that all are affected by it and with each other. And it could be, if it doesn't get managed some way, that going off to the room results in an argument later on, and this could spiral out and become a very nasty situation before it's over. All right? Now, I won't ask if anybody's ever experienced anything similar to that or not, but that happens, that kind of thing. Now, let's suppose the same scenario, but a more mature family. particularly the leaders of the family, the mom and dad, and suppose they've got a little more access to thoughtfulness in the presence of rising anxiety. What might they do? Well, she might decide when she gets into the garage to sit there for a minute and do what she's learned to calm herself. She may pray. She may think about something. She may say, I'm going to go in and be with my family now. And she might find a way to let go of some of that before she ever steps into the room. But even if she does, she hadn't let go of all of it, and it's going to be monitored. And this guy might see her walk in and notice some signs or signals and decide that it might be a good thing to lay the paper down and walk over to her and say, how's your day? Or have you had a hard day? And when she says, yeah, it was really pretty bad, they might talk about it. And anxiety is going down at that moment rather than spiraling up. And he might say, well, tell you what, why don't we order out, or let's go out, let's take the kids out to eat, or I'll go get something and bring it home, or can I help you make dinner? And there could be a variety of other responses that go on there. And you know what the kids are going to do when that all goes on? Probably pretty much whatever they were doing before they came in, because the anxiety's been managed by the responsible people in the system, and the kids don't have to catch it. And it could be a much quieter evening. Now, most of us live somewhere on that spectrum between these automatic responses and maybe more thoughtful ones. For me, the good news is that we can do a better job as in our families. We don't have to bat 1,000 to do that. So, hey, baseball fans, who are the baseball people in here? Okay, so you got a baseball player that in a lifetime batting average is 250. Not an exceptional fielder, but a lifetime batting average of 250. How's that going? Describe that person's salary and career, and what would you say? Average. He's going to make an average salary, which is better than any of us in this room. But it's not Hall of Fame stuff, right? 250. Now, okay, here's a player that lifetime bats 350. Salary? Anything he wants, over the top. Hall of Fame? Absolutely. Now, that's a pretty big difference in outcome between 250 and 350. But the difference in performance is this 350 hitter gets one more hit in every 4 times at bat. No, every 10 times at bat than this one. In about every 2.5 games, this guy gets one more hit than this one. But small difference in performance, huge difference in results and outcome. And yes, sir.
With the way baseball analytics are now, the way they do it, the 250 hitter, you might want the 250 hitter as to play with runners on base because his percentage of batting with runners in scoring position is higher.
Okay, we could go there, David. See, this is what I was telling you, Preston. Okay. I told Preston yesterday, I said, I preached in a congregation where it didn't matter what I used as an illustration. There was somebody there who knew twice about that as much as I did. So I was like, I just live with that. Thank you. You're right. But as far as family behavior is concerned, what we are up against is that we don't have to bat 1,000 to be an improved version. If we get it right once out of 10 times more frequently, we've improved things significantly. And nobody bats 1,000. So, but this is what I mean by an emotional system. And it helps to see it helps. One thing is to understand these are not bad people. Whoops, those are birds. These are not bad people that do such things, but they are reacting in ways that are less than helpful if it's an automatic response. And so the more we can learn to offer thoughtful responses and to put a little pause in between the automatic and the response, we tend to do a little better. Now, human beings are wired together naturally. I mean by that, that's the way God created us. Have you ever watched a flock of, say, blackbirds? They're down in South Texas, along where there's a lot of wheat growing. I know in Arkansas over Highway 67 around there's a lot of flat land with rice, I think it's over there. But the rice fields or the wheat field, these blackbirds gather and they fly. It's just amazing. It's like, how do they keep from running into each other? Because there's thousands of them and they're just doing this. And they all decide to land on the high lines at one time. Then they all decide to leave at the same time. And Well, they have this emotional response to each other. That is an automatic response. Their brains are wired by God to be sensitive to each other for survival's sake. You get outside that flock and you're hawk bait. And if you stay in there and if you had a bad brain and you couldn't monitor everybody else, you'd run in and crash. So they do that. Now, human beings can approximate that. But we fly in close formation only by a lot of intentionality about some of our systems. There are these fish of various kinds I've seen on television shows, sardines, and there's another kind. They're in these enormous schools of them. I mean, millions of them. And a shark, you think a shark with an open mouth could just have a buffet, right? Just to swim through with his mouth open and just take in all he wants. But when the shark swims in the middle of them, they just part. And the shark swims around and the school just parts, and finally, I watched, we watched a video of the shark finally just going, heck with it, I'll go find something else, and he leaves. Their survival depends on this intense sensitivity to each other. Now, human beings can't quite pull that off as intensely, but, we attempt it. Or you can see this herding instinct, like the wildebeest, who, when food or water is in short supply, there's famine, they automatically herd and migrate to another place where they can find what they need to survive. God made them so. Human beings do the same sort of thing. War or famine and these huge masses of human migrations take place. You watch social insects like ants work together to build and create, and human beings have done the same sort of thing. We end up looking a lot like the rest of creation sometime, don't we? I like this one. This is the mama and the daddy and the baby. And you like that one, Melinda? That's our son Alan and Catherine and Madison. And she's carrying Austin at that time. That was a few years ago. But it's funny how human beings and the rest of creation, we are wired to be sensitive to each other. Not at the same level that some of the other creatures are, but nevertheless, it's there. And so we live in that, and we breathe in that. We live in this same emotional stew as everybody else in the family does. And it is most intense in the nuclear family, husband, wife, children. But we are still very sensitive to generations before us, especially whether living or dead in some ways. And that is what we're talking about. This is one of the ways things get passed on from one generation to another. What is it that gets passed on in terms of managing anxiety? I would be glad to send you an email with a bibliography if you'd like to read more about some of these ideas on your own. But you can just check with me later and I'll do that. Dr. Murray Bowen is the one who originated this way of thinking about family systems back in the 1950s and 60s, and developed a theory that is called Bowen Family Systems Theory. And there were other family systems thinkers and all, but Bowen identified 8 interlocking concepts that became the core of his theory, and he said he didn't invent anything, he just watched, he just observed what human beings do. But he said there are only 4 human beings have in our repertoire, only 4 automatic responses to rising anxiety. You can subdivide one of them and make 5 if you want to, but really they're just 4. We don't have 5, we don't have 6. Human beings know 4 things to do automatically when anxiety rises. You've probably heard of fight and flight, right? Those are 2 of them. He's going to call that conflict and distance. But freeze is a 3rd one, which is he's going to call underfunctioning. But then there's still another one. But when anxiety rises, these are the things we know to do automatically. They don't say we have to do these things, but left to automatic, this is what we're going to see happen. Either we're going to pick a fight with somebody. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever been in your family where, and this didn't happen with Melinda and me, but I know other people that do this, where it just seems like somebody's wanted to pick a fight today? Now, I mean, what's up with that? Why do we do that? Why do we walk around suddenly with a chip on our shoulder? Anxiety has probably risen, but that's one symptom of it. Another is distance, is that we want to separate ourselves. That's flight, and we can do that in a lot of ways. Physically, we can do it, but we can also just zone out, where we're just not attending, not communicating. We can under functioning. That is, over functioning is where somebody, when they grow anxious, starts telling other people what to think, other people what to do, taking over their task, doing more than their responsibility. And what do the other people in the system do when the overfunctioner overfunctions? They let them do it. They underfunction. And you have to have both at the same time. Every overfunctioner has an underfunctioner that they rightly deserve, because they've helped. And both of them keep that going. Happens in church too, but we'll talk about that later on. But that's one of the things. Anxious people sometimes freeze, they underfunction, and there's someone who moves in and takes over for them, or they just automatically take over and others back off and say it's all yours. But that's an anxious response. That's not a thoughtful response. And the other is called projection. It looks like a lot of things. It can look like blame. It's that when we get anxious, we start looking for somebody to point a finger at. Or it can look like worry. We can decide altogether who to worry about in the family when we're anxious. And we can all decide that it's this child or this parent that we should be worried about. And when anxiety goes up, everybody turns attention and starts worrying over it. It's a way of managing that. There's another version of that is called triangling, where two people are upset with each other and they project that upset by contacting, one of them contacts a third person, and that sort of tends to manage things for a while. None of these are healthy ways of managing anxiety, and depending on how intense it is, they may be more or less. Conflict doesn't have to be a fist fight, and distance doesn't have to be a divorce. I mean, all of that's, on a continuum there, but they are anxious responses. Now, here's how that's helpful to me, is if you can imagine you've got a dashboard in front of you that has these gauges on it, and it's monitoring the family that you're part of, or the system you're a part of. And there's a gauge for conflict, and one for distance, and one for over-under functioning, and one for projection. And normally they're running at some ambient level. There's a little bit of conflict and there's a little bit of that all the time. But when the needles move, when one of the needles or more starts to move, the symptoms are increasing, then what you know is when these things come to pass, anxiety is at hand. Something has changed in the system, and it has been an increase in anxiety in some way or another. And now, it is not sufficient to respond by grabbing the needle on the thing and trying to pull it back. That wouldn't work on your car. That doesn't fix whatever's wrong. If you just go to let's just manage our conflict, and well, the anxiety didn't go away. So it's like playing that whack-a-mole game they used to have at the game places. You may squelch it over here, but if the source of it hasn't been dealt with, it's going to pop over here as one of the other symptoms. It doesn't go away. The thing that is to be managed is anxiety and our response to it, not the symptoms. The symptoms just help us know that something has changed. And to become kind of alert to those things and know that this anxious person who's just walked into my presence, angry, is not here to pick a fight with me. They didn't pick one yesterday. Why today? What's changed? And then to figure out how can I be more thoughtful in the presence of another person's anxiety is part of what we're up to. But that's called the emotional process, and it is what happens. And you don't have to carry around a long list in your head. It's just conflict, distance, over-under functioning, and projection, and that's what human beings do. And we do it over and over again in a lot of different ways and with a variety of intensity, but that's our whole repertoire when we run on automatic. Now, I want to talk about, let me stop at that point, and it is 10 till 11. So, see, we're talking about these variety of things that come to us via our families, the fire in which we're forged, and among those is the ways we respond to anxiety. And by the way, families tend to do better if they are pretty well-rounded and run on automatic and do all four of those things. Sometimes we fight, sometimes we do. If you ever get specialized in one of those, then they're a lot more intense. The fights are more intense, the distance more intense, other things like that. You might see that over-under functioning taking place in a family where, let's say, the husband has an alcohol addiction. That's an under-functioning role. And so he's not not pulling his weight. He's not showing up for work or keeping a job. And you have a wife who's calling the boss and making excuses for him, taking on an extra job. Yeah, I mean, those kind of things. She's doing more than her share, and he's doing less than his. But the issue, and of course that causes all kinds of other things. As I said, once anxiety's underway, anxiety creates anxiety. But if you don't get at the root of what's going on in that marriage and that family, just dealing with symptoms doesn't seem to help. And so you might think about your own family, about what you learned, where you saw those things happen, where you see them happen. And probably each of us learned more or less one of those ways of dealing with rising anxiety in our lives. And we learn it from the families we've come from. We're not, as far as we know, we're not genetically encoded to do one of those, but we have learned from one family or another which seems to be the most appropriate or the right way. But we do it automatically, and then we come up with a reason. I'm saying we seldom stop and think, what's changed? What's my part in this? How could I respond differently? And is there really a physical life threat going on right now or not that I need to be responding to? Anybody have anything you'd like to probe about that? I'm going to throw in really quickly one more concept out here, and then we'll take a break. And we come back, I want to look at one thing, at the story of Abraham and the patriarchs and see some of this stuff working in that story. There are two stories in the Bible where we have pretty extensive family information. And one is Abraham and his descendants, the other is David. And both of those are quite interesting to me because clearly the biblical writers weren't writing to explain any of this stuff. They're just describing what goes on in the families. And according to the theory, this is not something that belongs to North American white families. This is the way that human beings behave and have behaved for millennia in various cultures. And here's these stories of Abraham where these same things show up, and it's another culture, 4,000 years ago, but here they are, and we'll take a look at some of those in a bit. Let me throw out one more concept here that was part of Murray Bowen's thinking, and I haven't talked about all of them, but one that has to do with our families and the fire in which we were forged is, have you ever wondered about why it is that two kids growing up in the same family with the same gene pool and the same environment end up in such different ways? I mean, that's always people going, I don't know, I got one of these and one of these. Why did that happen? One of the reasons that Bowen would say is that families have a tendency to project, that's one of our automatic responses, project a worried focus on a child. And when a child is heavily worried over by his parents, who are the two most important people in his life, they tend not to do so well as the brother or sister who didn't get worried over so much, who tend to have a little more freedom and tend to actually end up doing a little better with life. So if you're one of those people that your parents worried about your brother or sister and didn't pay so much attention to you, and you might have resented that when you were a kid, write your brother or sister a thank you note saying thanks for keeping their attention off of me while but worrying over a child often it has effects that are detrimental in a child's well-being. And all parents worry over their children, even after they're grown adults, I understand that, but there is an intense worried focus that has a way of cycling downward, and it can be detrimental. But there's another reason that we're two kids different, because even if you grow up in the same house with the same parents, same gene pool, there is one thing unique about you, one thing in that family, and that is the place you hold in what one writer called the family constellation. That is your sibling position. Are you the oldest or the youngest? Are you brother or sister? Nobody else, even if you have a twin, shares exactly the same position in the family that you do. And that affects us the way. Now, this is something is called sibling position, and there are only a few options here. And I'm going to just show you what they are, and you can sort of peg yourself. And then there are variations on them because, especially in large families, and blended families and other things. But here are the possibilities. You could be the oldest brother of brothers, the youngest brother of brothers. You don't have to necessarily have three, all you have to do is have one, but you could be the youngest of brothers. You could be the oldest brother of sisters, the youngest brother of sisters. a male only child, oldest sister of sisters, youngest sister of sisters, youngest sister of brothers, female only child, middle child, twins, and that's it. I mean, somewhere in there is you. And of course, as I said, they get complicated with blended families and other things. But here's what Bowen and others, actually Bowen just borrowed the thinking of a man named Walter Toman, who has written a book called Family Constellations. He said that guy's described this perfectly well, and he just imported that as one of the concepts in his theory. But here's what, there are two things that we learn from our sibling position in particular. And that is we learn how to relate to people of the same and opposite gender. And we learn about power, how to get our way. Okay? Now, if you are the oldest brother of brothers, you don't have any relationships with sisters, and so there's some challenge there perhaps in how you learn to relate to the women that will later be in your life. But you've got your mother, that's about it, but you don't have sisters to relate to, but you have brothers. If you're the oldest brother of brothers, how do you get your way? Power. You're bigger, you're stronger, you were there first. It's your territory, they better not mess with it. I mean, we're talking about automatically, not your fine Christian children, okay? Okay. But running on automatic, older brothers, they learn to relate to guys, for one thing. I'm an older brother of a sister, and I didn't have brothers growing up. I had friends that were male, but to this day, I do not care to have a night out with the guys. If I want to go fishing, I'd rather go fishing by myself or with Melinda. I go fishing with guys and they ask me, I just don't go, hey, I hope some guys get together and go fishing. I just don't do that. I don't have this need. Now, guys that grow up with brothers might have a need for that. That's a part of their life, is a need. And same thing with women that grow up with sisters. They may very much want to have girl time and all that. But you grow up without sisters, you may not have that many women friends in your life. Our relationship to the opposite and the same gender are often affected deeply by how we grow up in that sibling constellation. As an older brother of a sister, I grew up being taught once very intentionally by my dad that women were to be protected and cared for, and not struck, as I did my sister on that occasion. And haven't done that to anybody since then. But there is a growing up where that is the case. And it may be that growing up as a younger sister or brother, there may have been very much a dependence upon the men in your life to be in a role like that. Vice versa. To grow up as a younger brother of a sister, you may have learned that you were to be taken care of by the women in your life, and you probably were. Older sisters have a tendency really quick to take on younger siblings in that sort of way. Now, if you think those are just some of the ways. Now, if you're the youngest, how do you get your way? What's that? Manipulation, being cute, funny, pitiful. I mean, there's a lot of ways that youngest everybody figures out a way to get your way, and youngest can't do it with the kind of overt power that oldest can, and so they find other ways to do that. Now, what happens when people get married? And we're talking about, Bowen used the term, all things being equal, which means, running on automatic. This isn't your horoscope. It's not like you're predetermined to always be this way. But we learn some ways in our family, and running on automatic, we might tend this way one way or another. So you get married, and you get two oldest that marry. Let's say an oldest sister of brother marries an oldest brother of sisters. What do you see coming in that marriage? Conflict. It's a king and a queen marrying, vying for the same territory. There's going to be a challenge in some way. That's called a role and gender, a rank conflict is what that is. Or let's say you get two youngers, younger sister of brothers and younger brother of sisters get married. What are they going to do? They're going to have a lot of fun. They're going to be terribly irresponsible. There's going to be some unpaid bills. There's just a lot of stuff that might happen in a case like that. There are marriages where the role gender relationships are usually complementary, where you have an older brother of sisters marrying an older sister of brothers and vice versa. People find a way to sort of fit into that a little bit better because they've been sort of used to that along the way in their life. And so you might think through about your own family, your siblings, your kids, and observing that. It's part of what goes on in family, part of what makes us who we are, it's part of the fire in which we were forged. Now, this even carries over into church life and other organizational life as well. Yeah.
Roberts is a married boy. Talk about only child.
Talk about what? Only child. According to Toman's thinking, the only child learns their stuff from the parent of the same gender. So are you an only child? No. Okay. And your mom, what's her rank among her family? Was she?
There were 8, and she was next to me.
She was what?
She was 7 out of 8.
Okay. And she had both brothers and sisters older than her. It's probable that, it would be, the theory would say you would mostly learn your stuff about this from her rank in her system. And, okay, well, whatever she learned how to survive among all those brothers and sisters. So it's worth thinking about. One of the things that dawned on me was how when I went to be pastor at University Baptist, there was a staff member there who was, I guess George was probably 10 or more years older than I was. And he had been there since the church started practically, worn every hat there except senior pastor. And the church was about 14 years old at the time. So he had been there a good 13 years. And here I am coming in 34 years old. This could be a problem in a staff relationship, depending on the character of both people involved, actually. But there was one thing we had going for us is that I'm an older child. And olders run the world. We do. You can get in the seminary classroom and ask, how many of y'all are older? Since like 80% of the class, we're going into leader. Yeah, how many of y'all are older? Yeah, it's our world. We run it. And it's, the rest of the... But George was the youngest brother of about 6 brothers, I think. He was quite comfortable working with someone supportively rather than having to have his own way. And I didn't know that going in. I wasn't reading and thinking this stuff back then, but in reflection, I think that's one of the things that contributed to a good working relationship that we had there was no competition for power there by either of us, but he was just, he was quite willing to work with a much younger pastor, but I was an older brother. That was something I had learned, so I learned sort of unconsciously to relate to the men in my life and the women in my life in that sort of way. And this isn't all good or bad, it just is. And so we have to figure out the ways it affects us positively or negatively. And yeah.
Casey just very observantly pointed out that you left out the middle child.
Yeah. Yeah, they're always left out. The middle children, it's sort of, sometimes there's a lot of space. Like in our family, we have a middle child, but we had a son, and then 3.5 years later, another son, and then 10 years later, a daughter. So there's some ways in which our middle son grew up as younger brother of brothers and older brother of sisters. He ends up with sort of, it just a lot depended, but if they were closer together in time, the middle child has some of those, just how long did they spend as the youngest before they were now older than somebody is, I think, part of the issue. If it wasn't a very long time, then you end up with sort of a blend of both of those things. If it was a long time, they may be more influenced by that first role that they had as a younger brother of a sister, are you talking about yourself or just a person? This is for a friend. Yeah, okay. Okay, your friend, Casey, does she have an older brother or an older sister?
I'm middle of 3 girls.
Middle of 3 girls, okay.
We're spaced 3 years.
And how much younger is your younger sister?
3 years.
Okay.
One thing I'm interested in is you talk about how older siblings get what they want and younger. How do middle children?
They don't. The middle will never get what they want. Just they might for a period of time till the younger one comes along and she's so cute and all of a sudden you're all forgotten. It's over. Yes, sir.
What is the theory when you've got a child that is in this position and is supposed to act this way, but doesn't?
Well, there are things that, again, all things being equal, this is a place to start and think about. And then that points out, well, here's an anomaly. And I think Melinda is a little bit like this. I'm going to speak for her. She has an older brother. I have a younger sister. So on paper, that works really good for us. But in a lot of ways, her brother was the worried focus of the family, and he didn't function all that well in life. He's made it along. He's married and lost a wife, and he's struggled, but he's just never been an older child leader kind of person. And Melinda, I think, had to step into that. You could speak for yourself about that, but I think had to step into some older child roles, even with your brother, even now sometimes. And other factors enter in and can cause somebody to either not fill that more leadership role, and others step into it. You just but it gives you a place to start going, well, that's not true of my family. Then what happened? What's going on? How would I think about that? We're going to take our break now, and in about 10, 15 minutes, come back and take a look at Abraham's family for a while and see if you see anything going on there. So thank you. We'll get back to that. Interesting conversations in the break. I want to say something just really quick about application and practice. So I think about these things. Is there anything I can do with them? Yeah, there really is. This is what I mean by going back into the fire in which we were forged. It's partly as understanding it. It's partly intentionally entering it with a different mindset, not to fix it, but to work on yourself in some way. And here's some examples. We were talking that, okay, there are 62 families in just the 5 generations preceding me, and I only know a couple of those. I don't even, so part of it is to become sort of, if you get interested in this sort of stuff, part of it is become a kind of objective researcher about your family. Genealogy is part of it. You can get on Ancestry.com and fill in a lot of blanks real fast in terms of names and dates, and that's helpful because it starts to give you a structure. And we're going to look at a family diagram in a little bit. We're going to use Abraham, but you can draw this of your own family if you want to work on it. But part of it is just knowing facts about my family, who they were, but then as much as you can finding out stories. And if you've got living parents or grandparents, trust me, there is a gold mine there. Do not neglect it. I didn't get into this till both my parents were deceased. And if I could spend a couple of hours with each of them just asking questions about their growing up, what kind of crises their family faced, how they managed them, what was it like being a child during the Depression, what was it like when they first got married. There's a ton of questions you never think to ask mom and dad. And they don't think you're interested, so they don't tell you, or they're too private or whatever. So if you've got resources there that are living resources, become an objective researcher about your family. You don't just want to know facts, but you want to know stories. You want to know how did they function, what they go through, what did they manage. You can come up with 1,000 questions if you were to ask them, and be able to do that if you could talk them into answering you honestly about that. So there's that. Another thing is, because I didn't have my family accessible to me, one of the things I set a goal one year. I had a cousin, an older cousin, who was very separated, cut off from our family, that I had only seen a few times in my life, a first cousin, and I determined I was going to try to find a way to get in touch with him. But the other thing is, we were very cut off from my dad's biological mother. Her name was Sula Culpepper. She died when she was only 31, and my dad was about 12. She was maybe 32, and he was 12, something about like that. And so clearly I never knew Sula Culpepper, but my grandfather remarried 10 years later, and that woman, Lily, became the grandmother that I knew growing up. But not only did I not know Sula Culpepper, I didn't know any of the Culpeppers that were those families that I came from. And they were in the same county. They're buried in the same cemeteries. And for whatever reason, I didn't grow up knowing those people. So I set a goal that I wanted to meet the oldest living Culpepper that I could find. And I didn't even know where to start. But in about 2 weeks, both of those things, without any effort on my part, well, I won't go into the one about the cousin, but in just a couple of weeks, something happened that put me in touch with that cousin. And then one day, this lady who sat right there in church came up to me after church and she said, we're kind of related. And I said, how is that? She said, well, my husband's uncle, John, is married to Mary. And she said, we were visiting them at the residence, the retirement home. And I showed her our church bulletin, and she saw your name on there, and she said, we have some Creeches in our family. And she said, I wonder if they're related. And I said, what was Mary's maiden name? It was Culpepper. She's 83 years old. And so I said, do you think she'd be open to a visit? And so Jenna and I went out and visited Mary one day out there, and she had pictures of my great-grandfather, who was John Thomas Jefferson Culpepper, who fought in the Civil War, and they a picture of him with his big black beard, this bandolier of ammunition, 2 6-guns sitting like this. He's a tough-looking character. And we went one day and visited the cemetery down in Lavaca County in Texas where he's buried. But just got in touch with Mary. Well, just about 2 years ago, I was preaching at a little town, South Texas, south of Floresville, where our family's all from, a little town called Kennedy. And I was walking up to the steps of First Baptist Church that morning, and this old gentleman with a hat on, old gentleman, about 94, 95, steps up to me and he says, young man, I think we're related. And I said, well, how's that? And he said, well, I saw your name that you were going to be preaching here, so I called my sister, Mary, it was the way, and said, we got a fellow named Creech that's going to be preaching at our church. She said, Robert Creech? He said, yes. She said, I met him. And so his name was Truett Hunter. And Truett took us out to lunch, and we talked family, and he had stories to tell. And he's 95, still running he drove us to lunch. And we went to a restaurant, and he's still running his insurance business, and he's an interesting man. And he later made a huge donation to Truett Seminary, by the way. Truett Hunter did, and not on my account. He just loved Baylor, and he was a Baylor graduate from the 1930s or something. I don't know. But at any rate, find these people and get to know them. I mean, that's one thing. The other thing is sort of determine you're going to be an important person to your family, a good resource. Most of you are, but that means showing up at funerals and showing up at family reunions and showing up at weddings and being present there. And when you get there, try to find some time not just to be in the group, but to call out one of those cousins or uncles or aunts out of the crowd and have a one-on-one conversation with them. But determine you're going to be important to your family. If they're spread out, all the more they need people who are determined to do that. And these are ways we go back into the fire in which we were forged and understand a little more about ourselves and our automatic reactions and maybe where some of our resources and strengths are. One of the questions I like to ask people when I have students do these family diagrams, one of the questions I like to ask is, okay, you've got a picture there of 3 generations of your family. Who's the wisest person in that family? And they don't usually have to think. Their finger just goes, it's Aunt so-and-so or Uncle so-and-so or my grandmother, my grandfather, my mother, my father. We have resources in our family that we know are resources, and it's like we should take care of that. If there's a wise person or 2 in our family, those should be people we spend some time with. They're the ones who've helped us be who we are. And we ignore our family or criticize it at great expense to ourselves. And this is the source of some good stuff. Chris, did you have something you wanted to say? Sure, positive. Okay. All right, you're good. Well, let's take a look at Abraham for a little bit. We could talk other ways about application, but let me get my thing back happy here. Okay. So here's Family Systems Operative 2000 BC. This is a fairly familiar story, but there's some details that come up when you start asking family questions about what's going on here. So the story starts in end of Genesis 11. I've been pointing at that one. I'll come point at this one for you guys, okay? Nahor, and we don't know his wife, and that's one of the things you find out when you start asking these questions about that. The women are not often named in these stories. When they are, it's usually for a pretty good reason, but often it's a very patriarchal society. But Nahor is married, and he has a son named Terah. And Terah died. Nahor died, but let me get this right. Okay, Nahor died, and he has a son named Terah. And Terah is father of Abram, a son named Nahor, and a son named Haran. We don't know his wife's name either. This is what's called a family diagram, and this is something you can work on with your own. Again, the squares represent men, the circles represent women. Conventional way to do that is always to put in a marriage. This represents a marriage with line down, line across, line up, and to put the woman on the right and the man on the left. That's conventional. And then the children show up on that line between the father that they're born to and the mother they're born to. If they're remarriages or something, they may be moved down, and they show up in the order of their birth.
Does this mean that no daughters, or they just might not?
Not mentioned in the story. These are just, again, if there are daughters in here, they don't get mentioned unless they've got some particular role to play. So that's what we got to work with.
If you were to do this now, wouldn't it be easier to do it from the younger?
Yeah, you mean if you were drawing your own? You would start down at the bottom and draw up, but left to right, you put the oldest on the left and the youngest on the right, is how the drawing is done. But if you were starting your own, you would start down at the bottom of the page or whatever and start going backwards usually. You can do it either, whatever it works, but conventionally you put oldest to youngest. So Terah, the next thing that happened, Haran marries someone we don't know, and he has two daughters that are mentioned by name, Milcah and Iscah, and in between is Lot. And Milcah, Haran dies, and Terah the father, at that point, when Haran dies, decides to begin a migration from Ur of the Chaldees over westward and southward. And he was headed for Canaan, it says. Now Abraham's just a kid here, or whatever, he's at least a child. I don't know if he's a kid or not, but this child dies before his father, and Terah takes his family, and he begins this migration. Now this could be a form of what Bowen called cutoff. Migration sometimes is. It's where intensity is so great in a family that they sort of go their separate ways, sometimes over an issue, and sometimes they couldn't put a finger on what the issue is. I mentioned the Culpepper branch of my family was cut off from the Creech branch, and she was my biological grandmother. I should have known some of these people. And more than that, my grandfather, Irvin, who married Sula, his brother married her sister. There were two Creeches married to two Culpeppers, and I didn't know any of these Culpeppers. That's just kind of an odd thing. That's called cutoff, and it's indicative of some anxiety that the family is dealing with, and it passes down from generation to generation. We tend to remain cut off unless we deliberately, intentionally bridge it. So this may or may not have been an example of cutoff, but they migrate, and Abraham marries Sarah. Nahor marries his niece, Milcah. And I do have a couple of first cousins married in my family, but I don't have any uncles and nieces getting married, but you might find that. Don't be surprised what you find if you start digging around. So they begin this migration to Canaan, and then Terah takes Abraham, Sarah, and Lot, and the four of them head toward Canaan. Now this family, Nahor's family, is going to stay back over in the east, and that's later where they're going to send a servant looking for Isaac's wife. They make their way, and Terah dies. They got it, by the way, the Genesis account is kind of interesting. You've got Terah has a son named Haran. He begins this migration, and when they came to a place called Haran, they stopped. The migration stopped. I don't know what all that means, but he parks it there. He's at Haran. And when he dies, another major influential death in the family, the migration picks up again. This is when God comes to Abraham and says, go to the land that I will show you, and I'll make you a great nation. So Genesis 12, Abraham, Sarah, and Lot continue the migration. And what happens next? The story is told in Genesis 13 of the conflict that develops between Abraham and his servants and Lot and his servants over grazing rights in an area, and they determine they're going to go their separate ways. And there is another kind of sort of cutoff that happens for a time there. On a family diagram where there's an intense conflict that shows up between individuals or families, that's sometimes indicated by a zaggedy line like that, or maybe more than one if it's very intense and you want to indicate that, and you want to show some of the emotional processes that are going on in this family. And there's eventually a kind of cutoff, and that's a symbol that indicates that. Abraham does come to Lot's rescue on one occasion, but there's not a lot of further interaction between Abraham and Lot. Abraham and Sarah, we're told, are barren. This is one of the symptoms that shows up in family life in the patriarchs, is the inability for a time to have a child. I firmly believe that reproduction is sometimes part of the emotional process. I'll give you an example. My parents were married 11 years before I was born, and I'm the firstborn. They didn't lose any children. They didn't have any children. There were no pregnancies for 11 years. And my dad was gone to World War II for a little while, and that accounts for some of that, but mostly no birth control, no children. And they were beginning to wonder whether my mother, or whether they could have children. Back then, mostly they would wonder, could my mother have children? But I think it became more important. That's not a one-sided deal, is it? So here, the day before I got married, I was moving furniture into our apartment that we were going to live in. My dad was helping me, and I asked him about that because I was just curious. I never had time. I wish I'd asked 1,000 questions like this, but I said, "Your mother didn't have any kids for so long. Why not?" Well, and then you did. And my sister was born 18 months after I was. And he said, "Well," here's like, "your Uncle Amon," okay, Amon was a Baptist preacher. He was for about 15 years pastor at First Baptist Jasper, Arkansas. He was, my Uncle Amon married my mother's oldest sister. He told your mother, no, he told me one time, he said, "Connie," that's my mother, "will not have any children until Kate Cryer dies." That's her mother, my grandmother. Now, Kate Cryer, whom I never knew, was physically ill a lot, and the youngest daughter of the three, Connie, my mother, was the one who was primarily responsible for taking care of her in a lot of ways. And so her emotional energy was going for taking care of her mother all this time. And my Baptist preacher uncle sort of realized that it wasn't likely there was going to be any children in the Creech household as long as Kate was alive, because she demanded everything. I mean, that family was sort of organized most of her life around her illness. Well, sure enough, she died in 1951. I was born December 1952, and my sister came along in 1954. Now, I kind of think that some reproductive processes are governed by emotional processes in families. And clearly not all. Some are physical, and there are other reasons, but at least some. Well, there's a lot of childlessness in these patriarchal families, and it just makes you wonder what's going on there, and then God intervenes and there are children born. So Abraham adopts Eleazar, his son. Now, here's the way you indicate an adoption with an A on that says this child is adopted. And then God tells Abraham, no, it's going to be a child of your own body. It's not going to be, the heir is not going to be Eleazar. In Genesis 16, still no progress in that childbearing thing. So Sarah tells Abraham that he should take Hagar, and if I drew this correctly, I just noticed I would have put Hagar over on this side up here, but the dotted line indicates a non-married relationship, okay? She says, take Hagar and have a child with her. And that was culturally appropriate, but Abraham agreed to do that, and Hagar becomes pregnant, but immediately there's tension described in the text between Sarah and Hagar. It may be culturally appropriate, but not emotionally so. She says to Hagar, he tells Abraham, you got to get rid of her, especially when she became pregnant. And so Hagar runs off, Genesis 16. That's where she is hiding there and ready to die. And God, the angel of the Lord, comes to her and says, no, you go back and submit to your mistress, and you're going to have a child, and he's going to have many offspring. And she calls God the God who sees me. It's a very poignant text that God saw her and all of what she was dealing with. And so she has Ishmael, son of Abraham. And the Lord tells Abraham, no, it's not going to be Ishmael. You and Sarah are going to have a child. And so when she comes back and Ishmael is born, the intensity is still there between Sarah and Hagar, but it really gets intense later. Now, meanwhile, Lot and Abraham who are cut off. There's a story told in Genesis 19 about Lot, and he's fleeing Sodom and Gomorrah, right? But he has sex with his two daughters, and they get him drunk, and because they're without children, and they have these two children born to them, Moab and Ben-Ami. We don't know the daughter's name. We don't know Lot's wife's name, but we know the names of these two offspring. That story is told over there. So again, the dotted line meaning not a married relationship, but you can also see that these are his daughters that these are born to. And then Isaac is born. And that really intensifies the relationship with Sarah. And finally, she and Ishmael are driven out and cut off from the family at that point. Ishmael marries an Egyptian girl, and there's a genealogy that enters in there, so there's a lot of names that show up in the story all of a sudden. But some of these become important to us in a little bit. Here's Nahor's genealogy. He's married to Milcah, and they have these children. There's two boys called Uz and Buzz. I wonder if they were twins. I don't know, but but he also has a handmaiden, Ruma, and these children born there. One of the important one of those for later stories is Bethuel, that we will hear about later. Meanwhile, back in Canaan, Sarah dies, and Abraham in his old age remarries and has 6 more kids. And they'll show up in another place in a little bit. But the family of Abraham is expanding in Genesis 25. And let's see what else we got here. Okay, this is Abraham and his second wife, Keturah, and they have these 6 children. And there are some stories told about them. I don't think there's anything in there that enters into the story of redemption so much there, but just to show that's how you would indicate a marriage. This child's the only one born to that marriage. This one was adopted in that marriage. And then all of these children were born to this marriage. And the X indicates a death. A double line would be used for a divorce. So these are Ishmael's sons. Abraham and Hagar had Ishmael. Ishmael ends up with 12 sons that are mentioned, assuming from that one wife, the Egyptian woman. And here's a picture of Jacob and Esau, part 1. Okay, this is a great family story. So here's where we were. When Sarah had just died, and there is Isaac. And then meanwhile, here is Nahor's family over here, married to Milcah. They have these 8 children, and Bethuel is the youngest, and he's married to some person we don't know. And Rebekah is his daughter, oldest daughter of brothers, and she is very much an in-control kind of person in all of her stories, and especially with the men in her life. And there's Laban, Rebekah's brother. Isaac, because of the servant sent over there to find a wife for Isaac, right? Sarah's still alive at that time. She doesn't want him marrying any of the local girls or anything. She wants him to go over there and marry the family. So they send the servant back over there. The servant meets Rebekah. They go back to the house. And this is very contrary to culture, is when the servant says, I want to take Rebekah back to marry my master, her father, Bethuel, and Laban are the men here who are technically in charge of her life. But what do they say? Let's go ask her if she's okay with this. You get a feel for Rebekah's, powerful dominance pretty early. And she said, I think I'd like to do that. So she goes back and marries Isaac. And this text says that when he married Rebekah, he was comforted after the death of his mother. And again, here is Isaac, he's youngest of this. He's sort of pictured in a rather passive role in most of the stories he's involved in, including, you got to wonder what his relationship with his dad was like after that worship service up on Mount Moriah. Mom might have played a much more important role in his life from that point forward. No more Father's Day cards. I mean, we're just going to, this is a little scary being with Dad with a knife. So, I don't know. But it does say specifically that he was comforted by his marriage to Rebekah after the death of his mother. And it's like some of that dependence gets transferred over here. And Rebekah's very much in charge of this marriage, as you know. Then Abraham eventually dies. And there's an interesting thing. After Abraham dies, the text says that Ishmael came back and helped in the burial of his father, as if there were some bridging of the cutoff there at Abraham's death. Now, Isaac's married to Rebekah, and they have these twin boys. This is how twins are sometimes indicated. Sometimes you'll see in diagrams that they just come off one point like that with two symbols. But here's one way of indicating. And so there's still an older and a younger, and that matters in that culture very much. Esau is the older. But from the very beginning, from birth, there is tension between these two. And it only gets worse as it goes further. And we're told that Isaac loved Esau and Rebekah loved Jacob. The straight lines are indications of intensity of relationship, usually a positive focus, but very intense. And so we've already got this sort of playing favorites that happened up here, didn't it? I mean, clearly Isaac was the favored son, and it's always the youngest in the biblical stories that is the one on whom favor is bestowed, which is contrary to culture and sort of an indicator to me of God's providence entering into this particular redemptive story, that the younger is the one rather than the older who is consistently the selected one. But here we've got Isaac and Rebekah. The intensity grows. There's the story of the stealing of the birthright. There's this, that's one of those things where mom conspires to send Jacob in dressed up like Esau to steal it. And you got to wonder how blind could Isaac have been to what degree was he going along with what he knew was inevitable? You don't know. It doesn't say. Esau marries two girls, both of them local girls. You can't see their names there, but they're named. And Jacob is still unmarried. And neither Abraham nor Rebekah liked these two girls very much at all. And it say they were greatly troubled by their daughters-in-law. They did not like the local girls. And so Esau swears he's going to kill Jacob. Rebekah uses that as a reason to send Jacob away to go find a wife somewhere else. And she says, I don't want him to marry one of the local girls. He needs to marry a nice Jewish girl. That's what he needs to do. So with all of that intensity growing, there is a triangle formed here. We'll talk about triangles maybe sometime between Isaac, Rebekah, and Jacob. And Rebekah's playing on that. There are these other triangles at work there in a lot of these intense relationships. So he goes back, and we go back to that part of the family again where Rebekah came from. And Laban's, meanwhile, her brothers had two daughters, Leah and Rachel, an older and a younger. And Esau marries a third wife who is trying to still make the parents happy. And it's not working. Generally, we were talking about this earlier, a son who brings a daughter-in-law home helps. It's your reward as parents for not killing your teenage son. But it didn't work in Esau's case. He should have, he couldn't bring home the right girl. So Jacob goes over there, and you know the story of how Laban tricks him, and he ends up marrying Leah, the oldest. And then he insists that he have Rachel, and so he ends up marrying Rachel. And they start having children. Mostly Leah's having children there. And when Rachel's not having children, she gives her handmaid Bilhah. And when she starts having children, Leah sees that's working, so she gives her handmaid Zilpah, and there's more children being born. And then Leah has children again. And finally, a daughter is born, Dinah is mentioned. And then Joseph is born, and Benjamin. And this whole competition for childbearing goes on for quite a while, but there's a large family formed out of all of that. And it has you'll see these family patterns passed down, the same kind of focus on the younger, favoritism, all the kind of things that cause problems in one generation end up showing up in another generation. Meanwhile, back there, Esau and his wives are having children as well. I say, Jacob and Esau, part 2. All right, they were already, at odds with each other. And Jacob marries Leah. Laban and Jacob have intense conflict, and Jacob's going to take his family and go back home eventually. He has an intense focus on Rachel. He loved Rachel more than Leah. And then he's got these children. Now, these children are going to show up with a number beside them because there's 4 wives, and you can't put them in birth order, so I just put a number there to show their order. Don't generally have that problem in doing family diagrams these days, but get them all up there. And it gets more intense with Laban and Jacob because he keeps cheating him. And finally, Jacob cuts off and takes his family and goes back home. Let me go back to that one. Let's see. Okay. Now, there is a story inserted in there where Levi and Simeon, Dinah is raped by a local fellow, and Levi and Simeon, older brothers taking care of younger sister, it's not these guys doing it, it's Levi and Simeon, go and seek vengeance on the people that had abused their sister. And then Benjamin is born, and Rachel dies at Benjamin's birth. And then Leah dies. And so here the story of Joseph and his brothers begins. Jacob loved Joseph just as his mother had focused on him and his father had focused on his brother. He puts a favored focus on the next to youngest child, Joseph, and also on Benjamin, the 2 sons of Rachel, his favored wife. And that favored focus, although if you were Joseph, you might want to be that person, it doesn't help the family system function well, does it? In fact, no. Joseph and all his brothers are at odds with each other, and he doesn't help. He comes up, I had this dream last night, and that you are all bowing down and worshiping me, and it's like, please, no more dreams. We don't want to hear that anymore. And then he's wearing the jacket, the coat of many colors, or the long sleeve coat, depending on how it's translated, but it was a physical indicator every time he put it on about who was the favorite kid in the family, right? And so that's going on. And so he and his brothers on that side are fairly separated. It's a pretty intense thing. Meanwhile, there's a story there about Judah. Judah is married to Shua's daughter, and they have these 3 sons. Er marries Tamar, and he dies, and Onan and Shelah, neither one will marry their sister-in-law, which protocol was to do so that she would have children in the brother's name, and they refused to do so, and so Judah refuses to make them, and so Tamar dresses up like a prostitute, seduces Judah, gets pregnant by him, and then reveals that truth to him. Tamar, by the way, makes it into Jesus' genealogy. The women in Jesus' genealogy all have stories, and Tamar is one of those. So there's that story sort of inserted in there. Well, let's see if there's anything else. And then I guess that's portrayed over there. And Joseph, that Joseph's stories with his brother and the reconciliation. But I want to look at, out of all of that patriarchal story, which is so intertwined, a couple of things. One thing, God used this family to do his work. This is not the story of a perfect family, not in any generation. There are faithful people in there who obeyed God and loved God, but they weren't perfect families by any means. And if anything, if ever we get to feeling like there's something imperfect about our family, it does not mean that our family is therefore outside the grace and providence of God to accomplish God's purposes through the family that we've come from, the family that follows us, and the generations that follow. That ought to be clear from the first book in the Bible. And this is Jesus' family, ultimately, a lot of generations back. Look at the kind of cutoff that happens there. Some of it is speculative. Why did Terah leave Ur for Canaan? We don't know, but he leaves his family behind. Abraham leaves Haran for Canaan. He separates from Lot. Hagar runs away from the conflict with Sarah. Hagar sent away later with Ishmael, her son. Jacob leaves Canaan to go to Haran. Jacob, Rachel, and Leah leave Laban and go back to Canaan and have to reconcile with Esau when they get there. But there's one more running away as a part of the thing. And then the cutoff between Joseph and his brothers that exists for so many years before Joseph reconciles it. Cutoff, by the way, always requires two people to cut off. And it is possible if you're in a cutoff position with a portion of your family to work at bridging that cutoff with contact and with information and hopefully ultimately a relationship over there somewhere. But that shows up in this family. The symptoms that show up, like childlessness, Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel all deal with that issue at one point. The symptom of incest, Lot and his daughters, Reuben and Bilhah, Judah and Tamar, that shows up in the story. The conflict that is present between these folk along the way that is quite intense. The distance that is there, I would think, between Abraham and Isaac, certainly between Jacob and Esau. There is a kind of over-under functioning thing going on there where Rebecca pretty much runs the show and Isaac lets her. There is this projection or sort of worried either positive or negative parental focus. Isaac receives all of this attention from both of his parents. Jacob is favored by Rebekah, Esau by Isaac, Rachel by Jacob, Joseph, Benjamin favored by Jacob. And then there are all these triangles that people are involved in over there. And then one of is this sibling position where normally the oldest are in charge. And this is where I kind of see very subtly in the family systems the providence of God at work is that God keeps raising the younger up over the older again and again and again. Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Rachel over Leah, Joseph over his brothers. And even in the next generation, when Joseph takes his two children, Manasseh and Ephraim, to be blessed by his father before he dies, the father puts his hand of blessing on he has his hands crossed, and Joseph says, no, this way, and he says, no, this way. And the youngest receives the blessing over his older brother. And then there's the story of an older brother functioning like older brothers when Reuben tries to be protective of Joseph. This is the oldest who says, let us not take his life. Reuben said, shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father. The older felt some responsibility to take care of his little brother, even if he did have dreams that he didn't like. Reuben said, did I not tell you not to wrong the boy? You would not listen, so now there comes a reckoning for his blood. Reuben said to his father, you may kill my two sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, I will bring him back to you. And then there's Dinah's brothers, Simeon and Levi coming to her defense and seeking revenge after the rape. And then just Sarah's significant role in the family is interesting to me. Isaac marries and is comforted following Sarah's death, as I mentioned. And Abraham remarries following Sarah's death, which when you're about 130 years old. He's not even remarried. He said, we need to find a place near a good elementary school. And so, don't worry. Medicare will pick up the bills for the childbirth. We're in good shape here. Oftentimes, not always, but I've read how often when there is a remarriage following a long marriage and a death, that the remarriage is an indicator of how important the marriage was to the survivor. And it's almost unthinkable to go on without such a relationship. And Abraham remarries following Sarah's death, even given all they'd been through. So all that just to say, the fire in which we were forged looks like that. Yours does too. These are not unusual stories for us. They're odd culturally in a place or two, but for the most part, it's human behavior. It's the stuff we understand, and it's the way we learn to behave, and we learn to do it in a family, from a family, and in that context. And we start working on ourselves to maybe be less reactive, less automatic by engaging that family intentionally and attempt to do so more materially. We don't try to fix them. We go in to work on ourselves in that context. But the fire is where we have to go back to. And that's the best place to work. And we do it by relationships, like I said, having goals, like being an important person to your family and showing up at important events. And one worthy goal is having a one-to-one relationship with as many members of your family as you can. One-to-one, not meaning they're your best friends or you like them. Nobody likes all the people in their family. Nobody asks you to. But I can know them as a person and they can know me as a person. What we tend to do with our families is relate to them in big groups. It's like back in the days when people wrote letters. Y'all remember that? Your piece of paper, a pen, you had to put it, fold it up a certain way, put it in an envelope, get a stamp, address it, send it off. You didn't get it for days. Remember that? Okay. Parents often wrote, one of the other parents might write to their child, and how do they sign off? Love you, Mom and Dad. Mom and Dad. But that is the way all of us still tend to relate to our parents. We mostly know them by the time we leave home as Mom and Dad. There's very few people who leave home and know their father as a person, know his story and what his life has been like and what he thinks and what he's up to and where he's been and what he's done. We very seldom have a one-to-one relationship with our father. We know characters on TV shows better than we know our own father or mother. We know Mom and Dad. We know them as our parents. And for most people, that's just where that knowledge ends. And often that way with siblings and certainly with grandparents and others. To have a goal of having a one-to-one relationship with people in your family is to say, I want to know them as a person and I want to be known as a person. I'd like them to know what I think and what I'm up against and where I've been and what I've done. I don't have to like them. I just need to know them. And that is a way of staying connected to family, this place of resource. Let's try to think of an example of that. Let me tell you one place this particular piece of knowledge attempted to be applied has been really helpful in my extended family. I could put a diagram of my family up there and show you my grandfather and his first wife and their 6 kids. My dad's the second, the oldest brother, the oldest boy, but the second child. And then 10 years pass, he remarries Lily. They have no children, so she's stepmother to these kids. She's only a little bit older than the oldest daughter. And for 10 years, that oldest daughter's been taking care, particularly of the 2 young boys that were just babies when mother died. And now we've got another woman, only a couple of years older than her, coming into the family to be stepmother to these boys. How do you think that went over? What do you think that family experienced? Anxiety. They said they were, and I didn't know this growing up. That when my grandfather was alive, those 6 kids and their kids, my 16 cousins, we got together all the time, several times a year. As far as I knew, we were a big, happy family. I didn't know any of that backstory. I didn't know any of it. But when my grandfather died in 1971, that was what would be called a nodal event in a family. And the family quickly split into 2 pieces. There were those who were going to have nothing further to do with their stepmother. And she was a character, I'll admit that. But she's also a really good person, but really tough person in a lot of ways. But there were some of them that just weren't going to have any more to do with that. And that was the older sister and the younger crew. And there were the ones in the middle that were a little older when she came along, and they didn't have the same sort of issues. My dad was one of those. My dad determined, he told me one time, he said, son, I don't care who she is or what she's done. I saw how my father, for years and years, he was a rural mail carrier, would come home after delivering mail and just lay on the bed and either sleep or cry in the daytime. He was apparently pretty depressed after the death of his wife, and I saw what a difference she made in his life, and I saw how she took care of him when he was old. He died of emphysema, and she worked hard taking care of him in the last few years of his life. He said, I'll do everything I can for her. Well, she waited. Her story was, I talked to her about this. She just died about 6 years ago. She was 94. She had the greatest revenge. She outlived all her stepchildren. And she told me that, she said, Irvin, my grandfather, Irvin told me to wait a year and see how the kids treated me, and then to rewrite the will. And so she waited a year, and she rewrote the will, and she had 100 acres of farmland there in south of San Antonio, and she left it to my dad. And he was to be the executor of her will. Well, she outlived him. Then for no reason other than that I was Joe's son, the will, she changed it and had it left to me and my sister. And I've got 14 cousins, none of whom had issues with her. We like each other. We grew up playing together. But I was the favored, focused child, particularly because, ironically, Joseph, my father, was the favored child. So she got ill, and we were taking care of her, and she was coming close to dying, and I was concerned about what this was going to do to relationships with my cousins. We quit gathering for a long time, and then one of my other cousins, Raina, said, these aren't our issues. We like each other. Why don't we start having, they call it the cousins reunion, and get back together? And so we started getting back together at my grandmother's farm, and we've been doing that for a couple of years, and then she was declining in health. She was 94 when she died. And when she was getting close to death, I was concerned about what this was going to do when the will was read to relationships. And I was talking to a counselor coach in family systems at that time, and I talked to her about that. She said, among your cousins, who are the most mature, the wisest? And I didn't have to think twice. I said, well, Raina and David. She said, why don't you call them, tell them what's up, ask them what they think about it. Okay. So I called Raina, and she lived in Colorado, and I told her how Lil was doing and what we were doing to take care of her, and I told her what was coming up, and she said, and I said, my relationships with my cousins are important to me, and I don't want this to ruin that, but it's a real puzzle to me. And I said, I'd like to know what you think. She said, well, let me think about it and get back to you. And she called back, or we talked again in a few days, and meanwhile, Melinda and I decided we were going to try to keep the place and keep it in the family and have a place for a family to return to. And I talked to Raina a few days later, and she said, I've been thinking about that. She said, if you could find it possible to keep the place and just sort of keep it in the family and have a place for people to come back to, she said, I think that'd be great. And I said, well, that's what we were thinking about. And I talked to David. He has 2 brothers, and he said, we already knew that was the case, and we don't have any problem with that. I mean, they had already talked about it. Sometimes we know stuff that nobody, you know stuff you don't know, you just know. And they hadn't read a will. They just knew where things were going to go. And so we had the funeral, and all the cousins participated, and then they came back for the cousins reunion. They came back and helped us clean out that place. And if you've ever had to clean out the house of a parent or a grandparent, you know what a task that is and how that could take months. We did it in a weekend because we had lots of hands, and relationships have stayed intact. And that, I just appreciate the wisdom of that, of just saying, I'm not going to let these things pass from one generation to another. Let's go ahead and have relationships with each other and talk about the things we need to talk about and see what, it could have gone south, it could have gone another way, but those were the 2 the wiser people, I think, in that line of folk, and that was helpful. Well, it's 12 o'clock, a little after, and we will stop and go eat lunch because they said the food won't be good if we don't eat it real fast.